Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Melissa Siegel and I'm a professor of migration studies. And this is a channel about all things migration. So today we're going to continue our series looking specifically at different country case studies. And today we'll be looking at Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a country that is very well known, especially for forced migration issues, and is probably one of the most well-known cases in this regard. So we're going to start today by looking at the migration history in Afghanistan, really looking from a pre-1978 period up until today. So let's just jump right in and get started. If you're interested, though, to learn more about the migration policy in Afghanistan or the current migration situation in Afghanistan, please do check those other videos that I will have linked here up above and in the description, so you can get the full gamut of the case study. So now let's jump right in and begin with the history of migration in Afghanistan. And when we're doing that, it's important to start in a, let's say, pre-1978 period. So Afghanistan is a country that really has had mobility as an essential part of the country's history. So for instance, there were many nomadic tribes and pastoralists also in Afghanistan. There are still currently, but especially in a pre-1978 period, we saw much more. There's also been a long history of migration, of a migration relationship with Pakistan and Iran because of both ethnic and religious ties, as well as having a border, sharing major borders. So for example, Pashtuns make up 20% of the population in Pakistan and 30% in Afghanistan. And actually, the Pashtun population in general is separated by the Pakistan-Afghanistan border that was established during the colonial period. So there's kind of an arbitrary border that breaks up this specific ethnic group. The Hazara ethnic group also in Afghanistan are Shia Muslims, which are different from most of the other population. And this is also the majority religion in Iran. So Hazaras have regularly engaged in migration to and from Iran, also based on religious ties and also usually where they are living in Afghanistan. There have also been very established patterns of labor and seasonal migration to Pakistan and Iran during this period. Now, if we move on to the first major wave of displacement, this was between 1978 and 1989. So there was a coup d'etat by the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, which led the country to unrest and civil war. And this was the first really major unrest in the country as a whole. In December of 1978, the Soviet army invaded the country and established a Soviet-organized regime. In the following decades, there was then generally a proxy war that was fought in Afghanistan between the US and the Soviet forces. So this went on for about a decade. There were conflicts between the US-supported guerrilla Mujahideen and the Soviet-backed government, which triggered mass displacement in the country during this period. The majority of people fled to Pakistan and Iran, and at that time they were also warmly welcomed, especially in Iran at the time. So the first wave of Afghan migrants was given kind of the noble Mohajirin status in Iran, and this is called also an involuntary religious migrant. As they entered Iran at the time of the Islamic Revolution and they were fleeing kind of an atheist occupying force, they were really welcomed with open arms in Iran at that time. The Mohajirin were granted permission to stay in Iran for an indefinite period of time. They had access to subsidized health services and free primary and secondary education, even though their participation in the labor market was mainly limited to low-wage and manual labor. In 1989, the Soviet army withdrew from Afghanistan, which led to an increase in instability and to a peak in refugee flows. So during this period, we saw a lot of infighting from the groups that were left in Afghanistan after the pullout of the Soviet forces in 1989. Then from 1990 to 2001, we enter into the period of the Taliban regime. So after all of the infighting that took place after the Soviets left the country, we really saw the Taliban emerge as one of the most important and strong forces that began to rule the country during this period. But there were plenty of continued conflicts during this period. As a result of these intensified conflicts, more than 6 million Afghans were displaced in 1990, and at this time they constituted the largest group of displaced persons worldwide. It's important to note also that Afghans held the #1 spot in largest displaced populations for 3 decades and were only recently overtaken by Syrians because of the Syrian conflict. So that is really a superlative that a country does not want to hold, having the largest number of refugees worldwide for 3 decades. During the Taliban regime, there were further displacement waves. In 1992, the communist government collapsed, and the country fell into civil war and kind of complete state anarchy. Here there was a second wave of migration out of Afghanistan, especially from the urban middle class that felt often the most threatened by the new regime. At the same time, the governments of Iran and Pakistan started repatriation programs. As a consequence, around 1.3 million Afghans voluntarily returned from Iran between 1992 and 1995. However, as the Taliban regime gained power in 1996, the number of refugees began to increase again to approximately 3.8 million refugees in 2001. The next period that's important for us to look at is the period after 2001. So in this period, first, we saw that Pakistan and Iran continued to promote policies to decrease the number of Afghan migrants and refugees in their countries. Pakistan closed many refugee camps in border areas with Afghans. In Iran, the increased costs of living, restricted school and healthcare access, and restricted access to legal employment for Afghans in the country really led to many feeling pressure to return. Additionally, and probably the most important point at this period, is that after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001 in the United States, so specifically the attacks on the Twin Towers and other key infrastructure, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. There was a clear war on terror, and Afghanistan received increasing attention from the international community as a place where terrorists were being harbored. The Taliban refused to hand over bin Laden at this time, so the U.S. and allied forces invaded Afghanistan and overthrew the Taliban government. After the defeat of the Taliban government, we saw a large number of refugees decide to return to the country. And from 2002 to 2007, we really saw a period of return migration and reintegration issues. Between 2002 and 2005, there was an unexpectedly large wave of returns to Afghanistan. UNHCR assisted 2.7 million returnees from Pakistan and more than 800,000 from Iran. An estimated 1.1 million Afghans who returned home independently from Iran and Pakistan did so without UNHCR assistance or other assistance. So at this time, there were a lot of returns. Some was assisted return by international organizations. Some was also not assisted return. It's really actually very difficult to estimate the full number of returnees during this period because there was such a large number of return, and it happened both assisted and unassisted. There were a number of both what we call push and pull factors in the decision for people to return to Pakistan. On the one hand, there was new confidence in the budding state, also based on donor pledges to rebuild the country. And on the other hand, there was the On the other hand, there was the deteriorating situation of living conditions in Iran and Pakistan. So there were multiple reasons for people to move back to Afghanistan at this period, and there was a very clear heightened situation of hope in the country. However, of course, during this time also there were a number of reintegration issues with the large numbers of returnees that came to the country. So international organizations and the Afghan government struggled to process and assist the high number of returnees to the country. There were issues of refugee reintegration and underdevelopment in the war-torn country. So many returned to find their properties destroyed or appropriated by other people, and many didn't have any land after decades of exile. There was also a weak labor market that wasn't able to absorb the influx of returnees coming into the country, and by 2004, there were more than 3 million registered returnees, which is a large number of people coming back to a country that had a very unstable economic situation. The government's initiatives to allocate unused land to refugees and IDPs have been plagued by endemic corruption and poor planning. So, for instance, there have been many issues of how beneficiaries were selected and that there was widespread corruption within this. Many beneficiaries were also unable to make a living with the land received, so they opted for settling in urban centers, which really swelled the size of Afghan cities and put city services under strain. The most notable of this is really Kabul, where the population of Kabul doubled, tripled, quadrupled in the years after 2001 and the overthrow of the Taliban regime. Here you can see the number of refugees that returned to Afghanistan between 2001 and 2016, and you can see that the largest numbers of refugee returnees were directly after the overthrow of the Taliban regime, but also continued till about 2007, 2008, 2009. And again, we've seen an uptick more recently in 2016. So if we look from 2007 to the present, after, of course, the first kind of boom of voluntary returnees between 2002 and 2007, we've seen really more dim economic opportunities for Afghans in Afghanistan. There have also been increased conflicts in Afghanistan with the Taliban insurgencies in parts of the country and ISIS terror attacks also in the country. There's been continuing pressure from Iran and Pakistan for decreasing Afghan refugee populations in their countries. For example, in 2016, Pakistan ordered all Afghans to leave. More than 500,000 refugees returned to Afghanistan following what Human Rights Watch calls a toxic combination of deportation threats and police abuses, amounting to the world's largest unlawful mass forced return of refugees in recent times. So really problematic return happening at this time. After 2010, international donors shifted focus from refugee returns and reintegration to the growing issue of internal displacement. So what you can see here in this final slide is really looking at the overview of the net migration rate as a percentage of the population from 1950s to what is projected also into the future. But what I want you to have a closer look here at is this sums quite well up the migration situation in the country with periods of displacement and return. So you can see very clearly from the 1970s onward, there were mass exodus from the country until the mid-1990s, later 1990s. Then we saw an increase in other forces in the countries, an increase in return, and we've had smaller waves of both in the more recent future. I'll leave it there for the moment. I hope this gave you a good understanding of the situation of the migration history in Afghanistan from a pre-1978 period until today. Again, if you would like to see the specific situation today, please check out that other video and also check out the video on policy. If you liked this video, if you found it helpful, please share it, like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any other videos. And I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.